Welcome to a deep dive where we take your sources and really unpack the core insights.
Yeah.
Today, we're diving into a really complex situation, pretty dramatic actually, unfolding in Brazil. It centers on Congresswoman Carla Zambelli and Supreme Court Justice Alexandre de Moraes. Many know him as Andão.
Right. And we've gathered commentary, video excerpts, things you've shared with us. They offer some, very strong viewpoints and key details about this whole saga. So our mission here is basically to walk you through this material, try to get to the heart of what these sources are actually saying is going on.
Okay, let's jump right in then. The sources we've got, they detail a pretty significant action by Justice Moraes concerning Carla Zambelli. It starts with him opening a new inquiry, right?
Yes, a new inquiry. But then there's a specific order that really stood out in the material we reviewed.
An order? What kind of order?
Well, the material highlights this new inquiry and then this directive straight to the central bank.
The central bank.
Okay. And what's really striking, according to these sources, is the demand for the names of everyone who made PIX donations, the instant payment system to Carla Zambelli, just within the last 30 days.
Hold on. Asking for donor names. Why would that be the focus? What's the interpretation there?
Well, the main commentator in these sources, their argument is, look, this isn't just about tracking money. It's presented very much as a deliberate intimidation tactic.
Intimidation. Against Zambelli herself, or?
The view from the source is it's aimed squarely at the donors. And, by extension, it targets the whole financial support base for certain political figures.
Ah, okay.
The idea, as presented, is to sort of instill fear, make people really hesitant to donate, especially to politicians seen as being on the right, like Zambelli, or maybe even others like Bolsonaro.
So basically, dry up their funding by scaring off supporters.
That's the alleged goal, yeah. According to this view, cripple their financial support.
So the insight here, really, from these sources, is that this move targeting donor info is seen as like a strategic play to hurt a political side financially.
That's precisely the interpretation offered in the material, yes. And the sources are quick to point out that Justice Moraes' actions didn't just stop there.
Right.
Alongside this inquiry and the donor list requests, he also went after Zambelli's social media accounts. Blocked them.
Blocking her account. Okay, that's significant in itself. But the sources mentioned something even more impactful, didn't they?
Yes. And this is where the situation, as it's described in the sources, really escalates. It gets quite personal.
How so?
The material states very explicitly that Moraes didn't just limit these actions to Zambelli herself. He reportedly extended the blocking, not just social media, but crucially, the bank accounts to her son and her mother.
Wait, her son and her mother. He blocked their bank accounts.
That's what the sources are reporting, yes.
Yeah.
And the reaction to that from the main commentator we're drawing from is incredibly sharp. Really strong language.
Well, I can imagine. What do they say?
He draws this really stark comparison, suggesting this move against family members for the alleged actions of just one person is reminiscent of tactics you might see in places like North Korea. Authoritarian regime.
North Korea, that's a powerful comparison.
It is. And the core of his criticism is basically that punishing the family for what an individual is accused of is just a severe overreach, something that operates completely outside established legal norms in his view.
And this specific action, targeting the family, it seems like it feeds into maybe a broader critique of Justice Moraes that's presented in these sources.
It absolutely does, yeah. The overarching argument you hear from critics, voiced by the commentators in this material, is that Justice Moraes is essentially operating outside the established legal framework, allegedly disregarding constitutional boundaries.
Right.
And the main commentator captures this very forcefully. He says, and this is a direct quote from the source, something like, "There's no law anymore. The law is the guy," meaning Moraes.
The law is the guy. That's quite a statement. It really conveys that perception of personalized power overriding the system.
Exactly. From that critical viewpoint, yes. It suggests the legal system is being, superseded by the actions of one very powerful figure.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit. Let's look at Carla Zambelli's side of things, her actions, her perspective, based on the material you've got. It started with her asking for donations, right? For a specific reason.
Yes, the sources indicate she did solicit donations, and she apparently stated the funds were needed to pay fines she'd already incurred. Which, isn't uncommon for politicians facing legal bills.
Right, seeking public support for legal costs.
Mm-hmm.
But then, according to these sources, what she did with that money became a real sticking point. a major criticism.
Yes, and here's where the narrative gets, well, complicated, and where the commentators in the sources become highly critical of her.
Okay.
The material highlights that she then allegedly used those donations money people gave, thinking it was for fines to buy a plane ticket and leave the country.
So donors thought legal fees. But the money actually paid for her travel out of Brazil.
That's the claim being presented, yes. And it's a key part of the criticism aimed at her in these sources. The main commentator sees it as, like, a double blow.
How so?
Well, first, it's seen as betraying the trust of the people who donated. But second, kind of ironically, it also potentially exposes those same donors to this inquiry from Justice Moraes, right? Because they donated to her.
Ah, right, because their names are now on that list he requested.
Exactly. And the material even includes what's described as Zambelli's own confession, basically confirming she used donation money specifically for that plane ticket to Italy.
To Italy, okay. And once she was out, or planning to leave, her public statements about it all weren't exactly low-key, were they?
Not at all, no. The sources detail her saying publicly that because she has an Italian passport, she's essentially untouchable in Italy.
Untouchable.
Yeah, suggesting she can only be arrested there if, the Italian justice system itself decides to pursue her. She seems to view that dual citizenship as a major shield.
And wasn't there also mention in the material about maybe looking elsewhere, another country?
Yes, the sources do note her mentioning the possibility of seeking asylum with Donald Trump in the U.S.
What Trump? Interesting.
Though apparently she also made a comment about the high cost of living in the U.S., sort of a practical consideration thrown in there.
Right. Okay, so beyond the travel plans and destinations, how does she frame her whole situation? What's her core defense as presented in these sources?
Her consistent defense, running through the material, is basically, I'm not a criminal, I'm a victim of political persecution.
Okay.
She maintains there's no real legitimate evidence against her, and she claims she's been denied her right to a proper, ample defense.
Does she give examples of being denied defense?
Yeah, she cites specifics, like her lawyer apparently not getting enough speaking time in some online hearing, and journalists supposedly being barred from accessing a virtual session about her case, things like that.
Did she point to a specific legal case she felt was unfair as an example of this persecution?
Yes, she specifically brought up a conviction she received for illegal weapon possession.
Okay.
Her point is that at the time of the alleged offense, she claims she held a valid federal permit for that weapon. So she uses this example to argue the legal actions aren't about actual law breaking, but are politically motivated.
And what about the prospect of facing jail time? How does she address that in the sources?
She's quite direct about it, according to the material. She says, look, if I had a guilty conscience, if I had actually failed legally, I'd accept prison. But, she says explicitly, she will not go to prison for what she sees purely as political persecution.
So what's her condition for returning?
Her stated position is she'll only return to Brazil when it's a democracy. Again, in her words, a place where she believes she could actually receive a fair trial and mount a proper defense.
Now, these public statements she made about her plans, her Italian passport, sounds like they didn't go unnoticed internationally, according to the sources.
Oh, they absolutely did not go unnoticed, no. The material highlights a reaction from Italy itself, specifically from Angelo Bonelli.
Who is he?
He's a member of the Italian parliament from the Green Europe Party, and he's already taken steps, public steps.
What kind of steps? Extradition requests?
Exactly. He has publicly called for Zambelli's extradition if she actually arrives in Italy.
Okay. And his reasoning?
His argument, as relayed in the sources, is pretty straightforward. Look, Italian citizenship shouldn't be used as a shield to just evade legal consequences or convictions from another country.
So her saying she was untouchable in Italy kind of prompted a direct challenge from within the Italian political system itself.
That seems to be the direct consequence highlighted in the material, yes. And the main commentator, the one whose views we've been drawing on, points to this as a direct result of her own communication style.
How so?
He uses this term, bocura. It's colloquial, basically means she talks too much, runs her mouth. And the insight from this commentator is that her being so public, so outspoken about everything, is actually a major tactical blunder. Because it reveals her hand, right? It shows her intentions, her potential escape routes. It basically gives her opponents a roadmap to counter her plans.
So the commentator thinks her planned Italian safe haven might now be shaky, precisely because she talked about it so openly before even getting there.
That's the critical link being made in that commentary, yeah. Her own words potentially undermining her own strategy, according to that perspective.
Interesting. Okay, let's step back for a moment. Beyond the specifics of Zambelli and Moraes, the sources you've looked at seem to use this whole situation to make a broader point, a critique about the Brazilian political and legal system itself.
Yes, absolutely. Commentators in the material, and this includes Nicolas Ferreira, who we mentioned briefly, they voice some really significant concerns. The core worry is that the fundamental legal framework, particularly the constitutional protections that are supposed to shield elected officials, is allegedly just not being respected right now.
How do they see those protections being ignored? What's the specific argument?
Well, Nicolas Ferreira's point, as it's laid out in the sources, really focuses on the constitutional protection deputies are meant to have against arrest.
Right.
The rule is supposed to be they can only be arrested in flagrante delicto, basically caught red-handed, and only for a non-bailable crime. And even then, the Chamber of Deputies has to review it, make a decision on the arrest within 24 hours.
Okay, specific process.
It's a very specific process. And his argument, their argument, is that this crucial constitutional safeguard, designed to protect elected representatives from arbitrary detention, is simply not being followed in practice, at least not in these high-profile cases.
And this point about protections for elected officials, it seems critical. And the sources suggest it has implications beyond just the politicians themselves.
Yes, it's presented as a very serious warning by both commentators we're looking at. A really stark warning, actually. The central argument goes like this. If elected representatives who have these specific constitutionally granted layers of protection can be subjected to actions that are perceived as illegal or outside the Constitution, well, then that sets a dangerous precedent for everyone, for the general population. Nicolas Ferreira says it explicitly in the source material. The alleged persecution of deputies is seen as just a step that paves the way for potentially targeting ordinary citizens next.
And the other commentator agrees.
Yes, the main commentator echoes this exact concern, and even adds a prediction. First, they target the right, but eventually the same tactics will be turned against the left. It's seen as an erosion of checks and balances that could affect anyone.
So the core insight here, from these sources' perspective, is that these actions against elected officials aren't just about them. They represent a potential breakdown of rights that could ultimately extend to everybody.
That is the powerful warning being articulated in the sources, yes. And there's also criticism directed within the material at other institutions, bodies you might expect to step up and defend parliamentary prerogatives.
Like who?
Specifically the Senate and also the President of the Chamber of Deputies. The commentators seem to imply that these figures are either, well, unable or maybe unwilling to effectively push back against what they see as judicial overreach.
Suggesting maybe they're aligned with the system they're criticizing?
That's sort of the implication, yeah, that there isn't a strong enough institutional defense of these principles happening.
Okay. And just pulling back to the main commentator's view on Zambelli's specific actions, her decision to flee.
Right. His perspective there is quite nuanced. He says, personally, he does believe she's being persecuted, primarily because she's a right-wing figure, and he actually says if he were in her shoes facing that, he'd probably try to flee too.
But he still criticizes her.
Yes. He strongly criticizes how she did it. The insight there is his view that, making videos, talking openly about her escape plans before she'd even successfully left. That was just a fundamental tactical mistake, something that actually hurt her own cause in his assessment.
Okay. So let's try to sort of wrap this up. Based on everything we've unpacked from these sources, what does this all really mean for you, the listener?
Well, we've seen how these sources paint a pretty dramatic picture, haven't we? You've got a politician facing intense legal pressure, accused by critics of using some really controversial means like misusing donation money to try and evade those problems.
Right.
And then finding her potential escape route, her plans, possibly complicated by her own public statements and, these international reactions.
Yeah, it's definitely a situation where you have these really strong accusations of political persecution on one side, clashing directly with serious criticisms of how the politician herself handled the situation, and these very grave claims from the sources that legal and constitutional norms are being disregarded by powerful figures in the judiciary.
Exactly. And this whole tangled situation, it raises a really important question, something for you to think about as you process all this information.
Which is?
What are the potential long-term consequences for a democracy, for its institutions, when different sides in a major political conflict start fiercely accusing each other of basically acting outside the rule of law? And maybe more importantly, how does that constant back and forth potentially affect the public's trust in the very institutions that are supposed to uphold those laws for everyone.